Ladies and gentlemen, John Sviokla here with Cosimo Leipold. Welcome to the Growth Innovators webinar. I'm super excited about this. I'm not going to do the Al Franken thing and say for a change, but Cosmo is an amazing friend and innovator, which I'll get to in just a minute. Again, the purpose of these things is to really look at folks who are innovating and growing in new ways and really setting the stage for the future in a bunch of domains. And welcome to the webinar. Please feel free, over on the right-hand side, you'll see a chat area. Please feel free to put questions in there and even just identify, hey, I'm here, where you're from and so forth would be great. I will try to work those questions in as we go along. All this material will be available for you after if you want to look at it, and we do it under a Creative Commons license, and we have other content underneath it. And we're all about trying to help anybody grow. That's our passion. So first, let me introduce Cosimo and why I'm so happy to have him here. Okay, so Cosimo, Italian by birth, Italian parents, living most of the time in the U.S., starts his academic career, secondary school, gets a BA from economics at Northwestern, not shabby. Then in 2009, he graduates with highest honors in strategy and finance from the Booth School. And if you know the Booth School at the University of Chicago, they have nine Nobel laureates in economics that have been on their faculty, including Richard Thaler, Eugene Fama, and Myron Scholes, which is kind of like the Babe Ruth, Mickey Mantle, and Ted Williams of economics, if you don't know those folks. And he got highest honors in that domain. So it starts not too shabby. And then I had the great fortune of working with him for 2 years at Diamond from 00 to 02. Then he goes self-employed for a few years, goes to Huron for a stint, Freddie Mac, joins the Emerging Leaders Program at United, so not too shabby. And he lands at Capital One for about 6 years, a little over 6 years and 3 months. And where does he land? In analytics and partnerships. And this is important. So think, if you know anything about Capital One, you know that doing analytics at Capital One is the content equivalent of arguing canon law, that is the base law of the Catholic Church at the Vatican. Because being able to do analytics at Capital One, not too shabby. So then in 2016, he goes to head of strategy and partnerships. As head of strategy and partnerships, he has set up Domino's as a delivery partner. Delivery is just a little bit important for them. Kroger's. And as of the 12th of this month, he did a deal with Uber Eats. So you know it's a duopoly between DoorDash and Uber Eats. And Uber Eats contributed $12 billion in 2022, the same as the ride business. So that's how big and important Uber Eats is to Uber. And I would bet is probably the more profitable part, although that's a little hard to figure out. One last thing, his name Cosimo reminds me of another genius, Cosimo de' Medici. And I don't know if you know about Cosimo de' Medici, but he was not only an amazing Florentine banker, the 13, 14, 1500s, but he was also a fantastic politician and a patron of the arts. So he supported Fra Angelico, Fra Filippo Lippi, Donatello. If you've ever seen Donatello's David, I almost prefer it to Michelangelo's David, and the eccentric Brunelleschi. And Brunelleschi actually was the engineer and architect who finished the Duomo on the Santa Maria del Fiore in Florence, which, if you know anything about Florence, it dominates the Po Valley. It is one of the architecturally magnificent places in the world. And that was the fruit of Cosimo de' Medici. So too, our Cosimo today is re-architecting the last mile in which we live, and I think has implications for all industries, especially for all of us who happen to live in the last mile, which is everybody. Cosimo, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, John. That was quite the introduction. I'll add that during my time at Diamond, it was often I want to be like John when I grow up. So being here today with you guys and your audience is, I think, particularly near and dear to my heart. And thank you for the invitation. It's awesome to be here.
It's delightful to have you here. So I'd love if you could just give us how you're thinking about the real basics. That is, as you're at Nuro and you're thinking about explaining what the difference is between autonomous vehicles, if you will, driverless cars, and what you're doing in terms of autonomous vehicles that are delivering stuff. I know that there's a bright line difference between those two things in terms of how you approach the problem and what you think the interesting things are.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting things we could talk about. I think, look, I think the the most relevant is how autonomy, and in particular goods autonomy, is a fundamentally different problem than passenger autonomy, and why
Yes.
folks should just think about that in a different way. And that's roughly what the vehicle looks like behind me for folks who haven't seen it. If you go to the website, you'll certainly be able to get better images than that one.
Sure.
But we've designed this vehicle that's about half the width of a traditional sedan and maybe 3/4 of the length. So it's a little bit narrower, a little bit a little bit smaller. It's about the same height, and there's a bunch of reasons for that. Partly so that the sensors can see over other vehicles, and other vehicles can see it.
Yes.
But it operates on public roads at speed, doing deliveries like any other vehicle, and it's governed in the same way. So it has to meet the same regulatory rules from the DOT, NHTSA, et cetera.
Sure.
But the initial thought or initial question that often comes up is like, well, isn't that just solving the same basic problem that passenger autonomy is solving? What is different about goods that enables something kind of unique? And there's really two parts. One is the vehicle itself means that we can do things to prioritize safety. So for example, on our 3rd generation vehicle, we actually have an airbag on the outside of the vehicle to protect what's on the outside rather than what's on the inside.
Yes.
But perhaps more importantly is on the software side. So if you think about the world of autonomy, you have to detect pedestrians and cats and dogs and everything in between. And so
Sure.
one could argue that that's the same whether you're carrying a human or not. But the really big difference, I think, is that with goods autonomy, you're able to relax this concept of comfort without relaxing the concept of safety. And so if you'll indulge me for 30 more seconds on this, if you think about this as like a function, right? You have 100 points you can allocate, or a percentage you can allocate. So you can either be X% safe and 1 minus X% comfortable. And what I mean by comfortable is, you're driving at speed, you're not tapping the brakes, you're not just pulling over for no reason, but you
Sure.
sort of have this intrinsic trade-off where you have to pick somewhere on this curve to exist. And you're always trying to pick where on that curve to be. And obviously you want to be 100% safe, but you also want to be 100% comfortable if you're doing passenger. With goods, we relax that autonomy problem. And so we're able to do things that you can't really, or that you wouldn't tolerate as a consumer of a self-driving passenger car. Namely,
Sure.
we can do things like pull over, we can drive more slowly, we can take a slightly longer route. All of those things become viable, achievable, reasonable when you're doing goods and not people. And that means that we can commercialize more quickly. So that's sort of the core of what's fundamentally different about goods autonomy versus passenger autonomy, and sort of why did we go down that path as opposed to sidewalk robots or drones or trucks or something else.
Yes, it's so interesting because I think architecturally, it's so different when you're, as you say, free of those constraints, which are essentially constraints set by human cognition and expectation structures, right? And you can go to the underlying function, very much like we did in networking with TCP/IP and protocol and packet protocols, right? You don't, yeah, it can imitate a phone call, but it can also do a bunch of other stuff. And then when you start thinking about the efficiency of the delivery system, hey, I can wait, if I'm delivering between 2 and 3 in the morning, I can wait for these things to aggregate. Hey, I can just completely reconceive of the efficiency of that network, I would think.
Very, very much so. One thing that I think is self-evident the moment you stop and just take 30 seconds to think about it, but maybe isn't obvious until you've done so, is the levers or the avenues of flexibility that autonomy can create. Like, they're things that now become possible that are just structurally impossible without autonomy. And they're everything from getting a small basket delivery, whether it's a milk and eggs. You're never really going to be able to pull that off economically, at least, with a human, right? Or you're going to have all sorts of hidden fees and other things.
DoorDash was happy they got down to $400 million in losses last quarter.
There you go, right? Yeah. And it's a challenge that autonomy fundamentally addresses, and it's really the core of what we're trying to do at Nuro, is make it easier and frankly cheaper for things to come to you as opposed to for you to go to them.
Yeah, no, it's phenomenally interesting. By the way, here's a better picture of the Nuro than before. And then we're starting to talk about this innovation in last mile delivery. Love to hear about some of the advances. And then we started to talk also about the imagining the future, and then more broadly shifts in logistics. So I think it's a kind of cool, setup. And that's why I think it's relevant to so many people. I mentioned the chat before. I just want to give a little bit of background in terms of maybe one vector, and you and I haven't had a chance to discuss this, so feel free to disagree or say whatever. But when I look at what you're doing, there's a bunch of things before. First of all, there's the idea of an autonomous vehicle. I'm putting cognition into a thing. And back in the late 40s, Elmer and Eloise were the first ones to be, programmatic robotics that were autonomous, right? They weren't connected to. And then we have the container revolution, right? And containers have been around for literally millennia, but in the 40s and 50s, and then up through the 60s, we have the modern container, which radically changed. And there's a fabulous book called Box that kind of talks about that. And the modularity of that just means you can do vastly different things. Like just think about alcohol delivery with Nuro, right? Because it's smart and contained, and I have to identify myself. I can put alcohol in places that otherwise maybe I couldn't. GPS as a substrate, and then mainstream wireless network ability. That those components, I think, are at least some of the big, infrastructure and thinking things that will influence and have set the stage for what you're talking about. And I think you add that, and you and I have talked a little bit about this, to one of our core themes at Manifold, which is the world's becoming more computable. That is, I can have a computing model of the world, the past, the present, and predictions for the future. The more I do that, the more I can reconfigure core infrastructures and capability. So anyway, let me get out of those for now. I just want to set a little bit of context. So what I'd love to do is to just get an idea of, what do you think are some of the new ways that we're managing last mile delivery that you're seeing, both in the things you're doing and in your partnerships and other innovative things that you might be competing with, and kind of how did it relate to the pandemic as an amplifier of all that, if you will, because I, for one, believe we're not going back to quote unquote business as usual.
Well, you stole the thunder a little bit there, I think.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's fine. It's exactly right. So, look, Nuro was basically founded on a couple of very simple hypotheses that now looking back perhaps feel self-evident, at the time less so, but. Sure. One was that the cost of human delivery was going to get worse, not better. And certainly that has proven to be true. Now, we didn't predict the Great Resignation. We didn't predict the current inflationary environment, but all of those things are sort of creating pressure on delivery, yes. or really, frankly, all manner of things, whether it's delivery or warehousing and other things. And then the second was that on-demand delivery was going to become the new normal. So if you look back in sort of 2016, 2015, maybe even a little earlier than that, companies like Bed Bath & Beyond still didn't even offer free delivery, much less free 2-day delivery. It was really only like a holiday season special thing with a minimum basket. And over time, the minimum basket went away, and then it wasn't a holiday season. And now, right. Blame or thank Amazon, depending on your point of view on this. What was 5-day became 2-day, became 1-day, became next day, same day, next hour, and pretty soon it's got to be teleported onto your doorstep before you realize it. And those two basic premises, and the third obviously being that goods autonomy is a different challenge than passenger, have really come to fruition. And so what we've seen is like this steady march to this new normal. And for some of our partners, we've seen growth on the order of 300 or 400% in terms of daily volume of deliveries that we do, simply by just lowering the cost of delivery, setting aside the impact of COVID. Now, COVID, I think, just added more fuel to the fire. And what it really did is I think it opened the door of delivery to people who perhaps previously were not interested, or they were on the fence, or yes. Reluctant for some reason or another. Now they've tried it. And so we believe that if we're able to bring the cost of delivery down significantly, right, from today's sort of standard price to something that's a fraction of that, you're going to see a massive, massive shift in the amount of volume that's going through. I mean, that's the first order impact, if you want to think about it that way. And we're seeing that already with some of our partners, even with, what I would argue is significant, but maybe modest relative to where it will be in the long term, cost reductions for them.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, are there any, numbers you can throw at that? I know you and I kicked around, you remind me of the numbers, but when Uber and Lyft, penetrated in San Francisco, the number of rides, I think, went up by, what was it, 3x from 50?
Yeah. So I don't have the precise dollar number in front of me for that figure, but I remember that quite well, because I remember it was quite stunning. It was something on the order of the following. So if you look at San Francisco, personal ride hailing type stuff. So
Yes.
Lyfts and Ubers, not goods. Pre Uber, there was something on the order of 35 million trips a year.
Right.
And
So this is cabs and limos and things like
cabs,
that.
limos, exactly, right?
Right.
And then sort of post ride hailing, if you will, if there's such
Right.
a thing. That number went up to about 100 million a year and was still growing, double-digit percentages the last time we looked. And yet the cost difference between sort of the average taxi versus the post-ride hailing Uber X or Lyft product was on the order of maybe 20 or 30% cheaper. It wasn't this radical, fraction of the prior cost. And so if something as small, I mean, it's still significant, a 20% cost decrease has a 3-4x kind of growth vector attached to it. What is a 3 or 4x decrease in cost going to do in terms of demand? And I think that's really where you're going to see massive growth. And I'll give you one other really interesting example. If you look at the Grubhubs of the world, the DoorDashes, the Uber Eats, and everything else, and you compare them to their Asian equivalents, so the Meituans, the Elemis, et cetera, and you look at the total aggregate volume that those companies versus the companies in Asia do on a daily basis, a city the size of Beijing or Shanghai, take your pick, either one, does 2 times the entire daily delivery volume of the United States combined. Each one of those. That's astounding. Now, part of that is density and other things, but a big part of that is that the ratio of the cost of labor relative to the ratio of the cost of goods is so different in Asia than it is in the United States. And effectively, what they kind of have is this, if you will, kind of almost like a canary in the coal mine for retailers.
Right.
What will happen to my business or my environment when the cost of delivery, frankly, looks more like it does in these more developing countries than it does in high cost countries like the U.S. and Europe and other places?
Yeah, amazingly so. I mean, it's just, it's so interesting. Yeah, could you go to some of that issue because in terms of density and city and so forth, and I don't know if these are blockers for autonomous vehicles for delivery of goods and so forth, but I remember we had an event one time where we had the Segway coming, and I'm sure you're aware of the Segway, the kind of 2-wheel, self-powered electric. What would you call it? You call it a Segway. I mean, it's between a unicycle and a bicycle and a go-kart, right? And I remember having a debate, and the folks were very happy. The folks promoting it were saying, "Hey, this is going to be used in cities and all that other stuff." And a bunch of us were saying, "Well, not so sure pedestrians are going to like that in New York and the whole routine." And special forces, yeah, they love the special forces because they land a bunch of Segways that are ultra souped up, and then they blow them up at the end of the mission. I mean, it's perfect, right? It's actually a disposable thing, and you can see how those people could use it. But and it turned out that the pushback was pretty hard, like the Google Glasses and so forth. So how do you guys not become the Segway of the Google Glasses of delivery?
I think there's a couple of components to that. One is just very simply that we operate on public roads, right? We're doing things in a commercial environment that are already known entities. And I'll give you sort of, I guess, the modern version of the Segway, if there's such a thing, maybe is the sidewalk robots today, right? Sidewalk robots are in effect appropriating a public good for private gain, namely the sidewalk, right? They're on the road in air quotes here, right? They're on the sidewalk doing deliveries, and they're, in that sense, they're probably a bit of a nuisance. Whereas I think people have already accepted the idea that commerce, movement of goods happens on public roads, and so this is a totally acceptable sort of construct and whatnot. The other piece is we focus on safety so much, right, that I think the acceptance of our technology is frankly easier in both sort of communities and from the regulatory standpoint. So as an example of this, we were the first company to receive a commercial deployment permit in the state of California for our vehicle. And the first, and I believe still maybe the only company to have received an exemption from NHTSA and DOT for our vehicles. So for instance,
I'm sorry, can you say it more slowly? The NDOT, the national.
Yeah, so from NHTSA, from the federal government, right? There's sort of state regulations and federal regulations. At the state level, the state of California granted us the first commercial deployment permit to use our vehicles for commercial purposes in an autonomous manner. And then the federal government gave us the permission to make modifications or exemptions, rather, for certain standards that normally would have to apply. So you think of things as simple as side view mirrors. They are technically required by law. I see. And for good reason. But if you don't have a human inside the vehicle, then the side view mirrors are actually not, frankly, providing any service. And if anything, they're actually a net negative
Right.
because now they're actually a protruding object that otherwise wouldn't need to be there.
Right.
So we've been able to get those exemptions or permits, I think, well ahead of the rest of the industry, in large part because we're doing goods.
I see.
And that, I think, is part of the story around, why does this make sense? How are we a good part of the community? And how do we sort of build this business alongside folks rather than sort of, force it or hoist it upon them, and suddenly you walk out your door and it's blocked by a sidewalk robot or something.
Right. Fascinating. And so how do you think about, Becky's asking, how do you think about places where there's limited infrastructure, limited roads, things are already crowded, that kind of thing?
Well, there's sort of two parts, right? There's one part which is all about like where does autonomy work well, right? We're in Houston, we're in California, and Phoenix, and then we have a test facility in Las Vegas. We have about 100-acre or so test track out there where we do our testing. So part of it is finding that right sort of mix of density, but also relatively, not too much traffic, but also has commercial operations, obviously, because you want to be delivering things. Sure. Not just sort of moving between people's homes, but yet not so dense that it's Shanghai, Beijing, or New York City. So a little bit, it's like finding that Goldilocks location where you've got demand and yet sort of viable parking and everything else. The other part of it, though, is part of the reason we designed the vehicle the way we did. Right? It is a smaller, narrower vehicle. Now it's still quite large if you saw it in person. It's sure. It's not a sidewalk robot by any stretch. But it is able to do things that I think regular vehicles couldn't do as easily. Namely, we can pull over, we can double park, we can do things like that because we're about half the width of a traditional sedan. So you imagine somebody like tailgating us, right? We're not a Ford F-150 truck. We're a much smaller vehicle, and it's much easier for that person to go around, even if we have to double park. And so it's all about creating a vehicle design that's both safe and frankly, courteous.
Yes. Cosimo, for our listeners, could you just take us through, like, how does a transaction work when I've got a controlled substance, alcohol, a drug, that is prescribed to me or so forth? How does that all work?
Yeah, so we're still solving some of the controlled substances pieces, but the mental model behind it is look, what you have is a very strong chain of custody. Model available to you because of this vehicle's design. So the vehicle has, for folks who haven't seen it, 2 compartments. Each of those compartments is pretty large. They can hold about 20 grocery bags or so. Inside each compartment, you can then further subdivide. So you can imagine like a locker system within the compartment, or one compartment's heated, one compartment's cooled. So if it's a prescription that has to be kept at a certain temperature or something like that, we have the ability to do that. Now, it's not a refrigerated truck, right? There's a limitation, but it's able to do that for sort of extended periods of time. And then the other part, of course, is this thing has more sensors than anything that's ever been on the road, probably near your home, right? And so we have cameras and radar and LiDAR and everything else. And because we have all of those things, we have a intrinsic record, if you will, of where it was loaded, what compartment it was put in, who inserted it, who locked it, what the PIN code was, what time that happened, where it was in the map, et cetera, where it went, how it delivered, was the person who picked it up the right person. And then we also have the ability to do things from the sort of side camera. So there's an iPad type screen on the vehicle itself where we can take input. So we can do things like, confirm your identity, or ask for a passcode or a PIN code, or hold up your ID so we can take a photo before we unlock the doors, things of that nature. And that gives us that chain of custody and that audit trail to be able to do things that otherwise might be quite difficult to do sort of under traditional circumstances, or would come with more risk.
That's very interesting. So you haven't implemented it yet, but you see a pretty clear path to, hey, John, hold up your iPhone, or face recognize on your iPhone comes that way. Show me your ID, scan it, just like you do when you walk in to buy booze at a liquor store in Mass here, right?
Exactly, but I think the key part is it's a repeatable, structured robotic process, right? Where we can have consistency and accuracy, right? I think one of the challenges for retailers today that want to sell alcohol, for instance, is that you have to adhere to this. As for folks who are familiar with the alcohol laws in the U.S., they're extraordinarily complex, and they vary by state, by county, by like everything under the sun.
Yeah.
And so, finding a way to consistently adhere programmatically to something like that, when you have a fleet of human drivers who are turning over, increasingly more frequently now, given, COVID and everything else, is just extraordinarily difficult to do. And so there are companies out there that just don't do alcohol. And I would imagine that for a lot of them, particularly restaurants, it's not a function of, they don't want the incremental revenue, certainly. Sure. It's more a function of the headache is sort of not worth the putt or the give. But if we had a solution where we could consistently and provide that safety net, and we Nuro can take on some of that sort of regulatory risk associated with adherence. Sure. Suddenly now it's a like set it and forget it, right? Very, very easy flip of a switch. We can just start offering as an upsell opportunity to restaurants and to others. Hey, would you also like to provide alcohol delivery with your deliveries? And we can do it without having to sort of implement it on their end, rather we implement it on our end.
Oh, that's fun. Hey, one of the kind of parlor games that I play sometimes when we're looking at a new business model, and sometimes at dinner at my house, if you come on over, is we take a business or an idea or a situation, we say, let's think like criminals, okay? And how do we screw this up, steal it, hustle it, whatever? So one of the things that came up when I saw your robot is, hey man, this looks like those people who used to just grab ATM machines entirely and then go open them up later. It's kind of like, well, I'm going to go grab one of your, I have images of Robbie the robot from Lost in Space going, but whatever. When I'm grabbing your robot and just, unpacking it later, have you guys given some thought to not just that, but, different ways that you could be attacked and what you would do about it?
Yeah, I mean, so
talk about it. I mentioned there's, sensitive things as well, right?
Yeah, no, sure, of course. I mean, look, the short answer is everybody asks this question. It's the first thing everyone thinks of is like, well, isn't it just going to get, robbed because there's not somebody there to yell at you? There's a bunch of reasons I think that's quite difficult to actually do in practice. One, the robot is the doors are locked, right? I mean, you would have to get a crowbar and sort of effectively try to actually break in. It's not just a question of saying open the door and off it opens. And then, we have all of the sensors, the cameras and everything else, and we know what's going on, right? And so if we detect that something's happening to the robot, right, we have the ability for one to sort of, dispatch the police and say exactly where this robot is, something is happening, someone's breaking in, whatever. Yes. But also, we can sort of have two-way communication through the robot. So there's a way for us to actually phone in, if you will, right, and have a conversation like a FaceTime call through the iPad on the front of the robot or the side of the robot. And so if something were to happen, we have the ability to say, hey,
what are you doing?
Please stop. And so it just hasn't happened. Now, will it happen? I'm sure it will happen. At some point, someone will attempt it, someone will succeed, someone will steal something. But it's like the most foolish option of what to do, right? Because if you're going to break into a car, break into the parked car that has no sensors. Don't break into the car that's got you on 17 different cameras. Yeah. Right. So there will be some challenges, I think, over time, for sure, we will have to deal with. But we've thought through a number of scenarios where that kind of thing could happen. And I think we have some pretty good strategies in place to manage it.
Yes. Yeah. That's certainly my impression that, they say prison's full of a combination of a bunch of dumb people and a few smart people and, whatever, Gary Meese asks, what does human involvement look like on a local level? That is, where are they controlled from? What happens if the robot becomes disabled? Kind of, I'm flashing to, I forget which movie has it where they're, all these folks, well, we can do it in Ready Player One, right? But, flying the drones and so forth, how does that work?
Yeah, so there's sort of two important parts there. And Gary, thanks for that question. It's a good question. One is that we don't control the robots. There's not, Ready Player One person who's driving this thing magically somewhere, right? The vehicle itself is a self-contained unit that is making decisions on how to move down the road. Yep. So what it's doing is it's using its cameras, its radar, its LiDAR, and everything else, and it's building a three-dimensional model of what's in front of it. It's detecting where everything is, all the cats, all the dogs, pedestrians, cyclists, trees, right, houses, all of it. Sure. And building a projection of where each of those things is going to be, several seconds in the future, and then deciding based upon that, what should I do, where should I be, and how do I move between point A and point B. And so the vehicle itself controls, the vast majority of its movement. Now, we do have the ability, if a vehicle gets disabled, to phone in, as I said before, and we can move that vehicle at low speed, right, not at meaningful speed, teleoperatedly, right? So we can use technology to just say, okay, I don't know, the thing got a flat tire, I've got to pull over, or I've got to pull into this lot, and you know, deal with it. Bless you. And we'll do that. So we have that ability. And then locally, you know, in Houston, Phoenix, Las Vegas, Mountain View, we have a staff of folks, obviously, that help maintain, manage, and repair robots as things come up.
Yep, got you. And so, as you see these rollouts, so you picked Goldilocks kind of domains. What is what are some of those parameters? You know, for what makes the porridge the right temperature? I guess. The Goldilocks analogy. Yeah.
Yeah, look, I think it's a number of factors, and they've shifted over time. So, you know, in the early years, back in 2017, the number one factor was, where can we do this legally, right? In the United States at the time.
Can I just pause for a second? In the early years, 5 years ago. Okay.
5 years ago. Yeah, sorry. That is, maybe it sounds a bit arrogant. I don't mean it that
way.
No,
not at all. Not arrogant at all. Just the fact of how quickly your market's moving. Yeah.
Markets move quick. That's true.
Yours in particular. Yeah.
You know, in 2017, most of our competitors, to the extent that they existed, were all in Phoenix. And the reason they had chosen Phoenix was it was sunny. The roads are really well kept. They're really wide. There's not a lot of trees and sort of other occlusions and things of that nature. Never really rains, doesn't snow. And legally, from a regulatory standpoint, the state of Arizona is happy to have you. So it was a great first choice. And that's actually where we started as well, in large part because of that. And then over time, we actually recognized that there were other markets that maybe were even better, even if they were perhaps slightly more challenging in some respects. So we went to Houston as our second market. I guess technically we're in California first, but really in terms of building a business, Houston was the first core market. And the reason behind that was it has sort of all of the dimensions that you would want. Namely, you have high-speed roads, low-speed roads, neighborhoods, commercial areas. It's a very large city, large population, large in terms of square miles, and a wide range of services and products and partners that we can partner with. And Phoenix has that to a certain degree, and we're still there, and we're in Las Vegas and other places as well. But it's that combination of like a good autonomy environment, if you will, and a good regulatory environment and reasonable weather, plus a real place to build a real business.
Hey, quick aside, in the tradition of Family Guy, do you know that a lot of NASA was supposed to be in North Cambridge, not in Houston?
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, after when Kennedy got shot, more of it got moved down to Houston. And so it should have been Cambridge. We have a problem instead of Houston. We have a problem. Anyway,
that doesn't sound the same. It doesn't ring the same to me.
Fair enough. Houston, we got a problem. All right, that's so interesting. So, and yeah, Houston. I mean, as maybe our listeners know or don't, was Houston the fifth largest city or fourth largest city in the U.S. now?
Something like that. Yeah,
growing and incredibly heterogeneous between the oil business, which is a global business, phenomenal, medical, unbelievable universities, fantastic art. It's just a lot of people don't realize just what a dynamic and growing place Houston is, boy, that's really interesting. So as you sit here, what do you think, as a student of your domain, right? And this fantastic, you can tell I'm in love with the domain. I mean, it's just like spectacular. This dynamic area. What do you think that just a general manager, somebody you did a deal with Kroger, somebody running a Kroger's, somebody, running a CVS, somebody running a hospital, a general manager at a consulting company. What do they need to understand? Or let me put it this way. What do you know that they should know to do their job better?
Oh, that's a good question. No one's ever framed it quite that way. I think it's probably just a combination of two things that you have to believe. And for me, like I clearly, right, I believe them 6 years ago. I believe them even more, even more today than I did then, because I think they just continue to prove true. One is that, look, delivery is here to stay, and it's going to continue to grow, right? I mean, I don't remember if it was a year or 2 years ago, there was a point, there was an inflection point where for the first time in America, people actually ordered in food more than they went to the grocery store. The total annual spend on restaurants exceeded the annual spend on groceries. And like, I think that trend isn't is not going to go away. In fact, it's just going to continue to accelerate. And so part of it is like recognizing that, hey, there's this opportunity that's out there, and it's a really, really significant one. Yes. That folks can tap into. And then second is recognizing that it's actually more achievable than passenger. And I sort of talked about that one already. But the way we do this with folks, right? When we get a call from, we have public partnerships with Kroger, Domino's, Walmart, FedEx, 7-Eleven, and now Uber Eats, as well as a few others we haven't yet announced. When we get calls from those folks, typically the first step is we'll actually sit down with them and we'll do a pretty significant data-driven analysis of where their stores are and what their current volume looks like, as well as what it looks like in the future. And we're able to build really detailed maps, literal maps and analyses around, hey, of all the deliveries you did last year, for sake of argument, how many of those could have been serviced by AV today, tomorrow, a year from now, based upon current state of autonomy, expected state of autonomy, et cetera? And what would be the implied price if that were to be the case? And how does that then change your model? And I think that sort of joint analysis is a core part of how we've been able to build our businesses and build our partnerships. Yeah. Because frankly, if that analysis yields an answer it's not exciting, well, that's not really often the case, but it has happened. And when it does, it's okay, great. I mean, too bad, but neither party is going to spend unnecessary cycles. And by the way, you as the counterparty to Nuro now know that AV is not something that you should be too concerned about. Now, more often than not, we find that the volume is there and that the pricing savings are significant. But on occasion, we do find that it's not, what folks would think it might otherwise be, or the distances are too far or something of that nature.
Yes. It's so interesting. One of the stats that we dug up, there's over 100 billion packages sent worldwide, and that number could double by 2030. There's a dear friend of mine, Ellen Levy, who's a brilliant woman, Stanford PhD, and just super strategy. She was one of the first people at LinkedIn. She did some of their early strategy work and so forth. And she has this wonderful phrase where she said, look, in the Industrial Revolution, the fixed point was the supply. Right. And we can see it in the way we even describe business. Yeah. I'm going to the bank. I'm going to the grocery store. Right. I go to the supply. Right. And she said the big difference here is the fixed point is the customer. And everything comes around the customer. And that deconstruct, as you can see Amazon doing and others, and you guys, I think, are going to do. I mean, what are you really? Are you a logistics company? Well, kind of. Are you a delivery company? Kind of. You know things are deconstructing when you can't call it a thing, right? When you can't use an old noun to describe it, you know what I mean? And I think your company is like that, and what you're doing. I mean, right now it's pretty easy, AV last mile, but you're setting a mesh of capability. Anyway, so to your point, I mean, she thinks that is and she invests along that. And in the words of my Polish grandmother, she's done okay in this country. So my question for you is, right now, is it true that it's all business to consumer? Kroger's puts the stuff in, goes to my house. Is that true? If that is true, do you see when John, can send something to my son 2 miles away on your Nuro device?
So yes, currently that is true. It's all B2B2C. Right. But the vision is for this to be ubiquitous and accessible broadly. I mean, one of the exciting things about our relationship with Uber that we announced now 2 weeks ago or so was, up until this point, we worked with mostly very large, well-known global brands and frankly, the leaders in their respective industries, right? So Walmart, Kroger, FedEx, et cetera. Uber, as a leader in their own industry, also has sort of one interesting little added new wrinkle for us, which I'm excited about, which is now we can start building our technology and bringing our technology to smaller mom and pop shops as well. So It is, for the time being and for the foreseeable future, going to be B2B2C, right? Yes. Pizza, Domino's, whatever, right? Things directly to you. But longer term, and this is probably dating myself, right? But sort of, you think of the old Grey Poupon commercials from way back when, right? The person saying, "Can I borrow this?" We've talked about that, right? We've talked about, this idea of like a neighborhood robot that just provides access to, sharing stuff in the neighborhood. You need to borrow something from a friend, or you want to send something down the street. 100%. That is totally part of the vision, and I think it'll be part of it as the technology matures and as we get more vehicles on the road.
Yeah, it's interesting, Cosimo, because we're seeing, we're doing, for example, some work for a healthcare company that basically has looked at consumption patterns of the full life cycle of healthcare services. Okay, episodic, simple episodic care, complex episode, ear infection, complex episodic care, knee replacement, simple chronic, type 2 diabetes, complex chronic, COPD, cardiovascular disease, blah blah blah, right? All that stuff. And if you look at the demand patterns, except when people move, and a lot of people move, right? All the consumption is in a very small radius, right? Once somebody gets situated, by and large. And so they're saying, hey, can we rescale back to having the variety necessary to serve the full life cycle of demands within a particular geography? And of course, the better geographies are the Goldilocks geographies, right? And the growing ones and so forth. And we're starting to see that phenomenon of rescaling all over the place, right? We're doing some work for a bank that we're talking about rescaling to basically, we have a platform concept that is really kind of cool where if it works, and I can't tell you about it, unfortunately, but if it works, we think it might help push against the Walmart effect, which Gallup says that when a Walmart moves in, a typical American family, about $65,000, a household, will save roughly 5% of that, $3,000 to $3,500 a year on their normal basket of goods and services, right? Problem is that you've hauled it out downtown, right? and all that other stuff, so forget that, right? I don't think that's put in calculation, but and we think that we may be designing a model where that relocalization could get reinvigorated, and the households and the value comes from superior pricing and availability for the households, and an improvement in marketing cost for the small businesses who generally spend between 5 and 8% on marketing, right? And anyway, it's a long way of saying I think that this trend of relocalization, along with Ellen's insight, the fixed point is the customer, new scaling dynamics, which given where you went to school, the most rational business school there is, having taught at a quasi-rational business school, the most rational business school out there. Scale economics are massive, right? Industrial economics are massive, and we're talking about a rescaling factor, which is, analytically and kind of cerebrally, why I think it's so important for everybody to rethink this stuff. You know what I mean?
I do. What you're describing is we see it in all sorts of places. There's one that's public that you can look up and I can talk about. Domino's has spent a lot of time talking about their fortressing strategy, right? Or even for that matter, Starbucks, you're talking about sort of the third place or meeting you where you are. Right. But if you look at what Domino's has done, this stuff is, again, public. You can find it in annual reports and things of that nature. They will open up a second store near an existing store. They'll split the delivery areas of both stores, and both stores' volumes will go up greater than what the aggregate was before, right? So you've got more stores servicing the same population, and yet somehow it yields 1 + 1 = 3. And their argument or belief, I think, is stemmed in much of the same things we believe in, which is, look, quality of service really matters. Historically, you've either had to pick between slow and cheap in air quotes, right? Sort of the FedExes, Amazons of the world, or really fast and really expensive, the Instacarts, the Uber. You've never really been able to have both. Everyone has to live on this efficiency curve. And somewhere on that curve, you've got to pick where you want to be on this sort of speed and price combination. But with AV, now suddenly this curve can shift out to sort of go down the Chicago Booth classical economics side of the house. And now you found a new point. You found a new efficiency frontier. And that, I think, is what's going to start to change how these things work, right? We think about it a little bit as like there are tectonic shifts in industry. Right. The first one, maybe, or not the first one, but one of which certainly was the advent of the modern supply chain, right? Sort of Walmart's birth to existence. That
some economists put, a good amount of the entire productivity of late 1980s to 2000 to Walmart, like half, 2/3. Not Walmart itself, but like efficient consumer response, logistical. It's a big number. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the missing part of that equation, the one that I get kind of excited about is, folks tend to think about, how did Walmart come to be? And it's often the answer is innovation in supply chain and everything else. And that's certainly a big part of it. Well,
Sure.
another big part of it was like, there's a thing called cars and they exist. And
Right.
so there's a tendency, I think, to think about, what happens when we remove the driver from a car? Well, it's a driverless vehicle, but that's a little bit like saying, the car was a horseless carriage. Right. And no one would have surmised that this thing called Walmart was going to exist one day, because one day this thing called a horseless carriage exists.
Right.
And so it's easy to sort of draw a straight line between 2 points and say, well, the things that we do today that I can already intuit that I already do will eventually be replaced by self-driving cars. I think it's almost more interesting to wonder, what are the things that I don't do today or that I haven't yet even thought of that could happen, because now it's not a horseless carriage, it's not even a driverless car, it's an occupantless car that does something that didn't exist before.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you just think about, a lot of the constraints of commerce are essentially, I think of them as kind of like the bones of a previous living thing, right? The thing is, we're all kind of hermit crabs. We're all inhabiting the shell of something else, right? In our thinking about this stuff, right? And there are so many places where you can change the economies of scale. One question I have for you is, do you think one of the parlor games that we play sometimes, and again, you can tell I'm a really kind of nerdy guy, but what do you think the future structure of this industry is going to be? Is it going to be Uber, Lyft, Google, Facebook? My guess is a lot of it has to do with how you do the architecture. But again, as head of strategy, maybe you can't say it's going to like John, we're not talking about that. Thank you very much.
I mean, I think that I know that whatever answer I have is the wrong answer, and because it's just so impossible to predict how this is going to shape up. Right.
Sure.
I mean, I go back to that example of the horseless carriage invented this thing called Walmart, and who would have ever thought that?
Yep. Sure.
So what is this going to end up looking like? Is it an Uber Lyft kind of dynamic, or an Amazon, FedEx, Google sort of? I really don't know.
Yes.
I think we're open to sort of exploring and figuring out how to make the right outcomes happen. I mean, what we really want to do at the end of the day, you mentioned a number earlier, I think about 100 billion. There's 100 billion personal vehicle trips a year in service of goods and errands today.
Oh, really?
We want to not eliminate perhaps, but we certainly want to, reduce those and make it so it's frankly better for stuff to come to you than for you to go to it. And whatever model sort of emerges that enables us to have that broadest impact, I think is the model that we're going to lean into and make happen. Which is actually a good maybe segue to Edgar posted a question about the negative pressure on labor markets. Sort of 2 or 3 things I would tell you there. Number one, like we're hyper attuned to the fact that there is an argument that one can put out there that is, hey, are you a job destroyer, right? And I think there's sort of 2 things. Number one, we've done studies and we've posted about this publicly. You can find them on our blog, et cetera, where we've actually had independent third parties do studies on the impact of autonomy on jobs in general. And what they found is actually it is a job creator, but it's more of a shift in the types of activities that people are doing. So instead of driving, now you're going to see more maintenance, you're going to see more charging stations, you're going to see a different set of activities as opposed to the ones that existed before. But the net is that you actually create jobs as opposed to destroy them. The other is that we're not looking to fully replace human drivers, right? That's not the vision. So if you look at, food as a good example of this, it economically, it would make sense. Let's take pizza as an example. Economically, it would make sense for us to put 20 pizzas in the robot and just drive down the road and drop off every pizza like a FedEx truck would drop off packages. But obviously, if you're the 20th person in there, you're getting the coldest pizza and the worst product. So that's not what we're going to do, right? What we've built is this vehicle that is really more focused on demand as opposed to sort of batch deliveries. And what that's probably going to yield is an outcome where you still have human drivers and you have autonomous drivers, and they work in concert with one another, right? Where the human driver is doing certain deliveries and the robot's doing other deliveries. And it may end up being that the way this sort of nets out is, there's some deliveries that are more valuable, more creative, or preferred for humans to do, and there's certain deliveries that may be more valuable for robots to do. And one really interesting insight, if you'll bear with me 30 more seconds, is
take your time.
And this was a really early study that we did, but it was sort of fundamental to, is this going to work? Because with robots, you have to come out to the curb and actually, do something. So if people are unwilling to leave their home to get your stuff, who cares about how good your autonomy is? It's not going to work. And one thing we did early on was we did this study on, are people willing to trade, the convenience of somebody coming up to your front door for a robot that arguably costs less? And if so, how much less does they have to cost? And what we found was really, really interesting. We had a proportion of people in the survey who actually said, it's really important that you come to my door. That's what I want. And then we gave them the choice between option A, you pay for regular delivery, and option B, you pay somewhat less for a robotic delivery. And even in that proportion, 70, 80, I think it was 85% or something on that order of people pick the robotic delivery. So then we followed up and we said, well, hold on. You just said it's really important I come to your door, and yet you just pick the thing that doesn't come to your door. Ein Minuten bitte. What is that? What do you mean? And what came out of that was this insight that people associate the act of tipping, not with the act of driving to your house, but with the act of getting out of the car and bringing you your goods. And so if we're able to actually remove the tip from deliveries, that alone is sufficient as an incentive for people to switch to robotic delivery. And so it might be that the long-term steady state here is one where, there are certain customers for whom tipping is really not preferable, and for whom this is a great service. And there are others who really value that and they're willing to tip for it. And so I think you'll find a natural equilibrium where both humans and robots sort of service the right subset of customers and orders, if that makes sense. And hopefully, Edgar, that makes some sense, but feel free to follow up with more questions if not.
Yeah, my guess is that the long-term effect of DoorDash and Uber Eats at their current economics will be to push more people out of the restaurant, more labor out of the restaurant business than is absorbed in the delivery, and more consolidation to chain-like stores that can afford subsidy of transport that a local business can't, because they have scale economics. So my guess is just in comparing those two labor markets, I bet you destroy jobs through human beings driving stuff, but who knows?
One last thing maybe to note is we have a program where we've actually partnered with local universities in Houston to do training programs for people to become, certified maintenance folks and things of that nature, and work on autonomous vehicles. So and that is, because we think it's the right thing to do, but also because it's a real need, right? We need to hire folks that can work on these technologies, and today there's just not a whole lot of them. So we want to build that workforce up, frankly, nationally, not just in Houston.
Yeah, well, I'm really interested, back to the thing I mentioned before about the care network and so forth, that if you look at healthcare clusters, for example, where you build up provider care and other skilled nursing facility, the whole, not just in the hospital stuff, but nursing facilities, rehab places, long-term care, all that stuff. The something like 60, first of all, you have massive labor absorption because human beings still like to be taken care of by human beings by and large. And some of that's, choice, some of that's regulation, some of that's risk and knowledge, whatever. And over half of the jobs, you don't need a high school education. You can get through with a high school education. So you talk about labor absorption, healthcare. And then, so to the extent that, your solution could, and I don't know, if are you guys working with the folks at Lake Nona down in Florida?
No, not yet.
Okay, well, we'll talk later. I'll introduce you to this brilliant British trader who made billions of dollars in currency markets, bought 15 square miles of Florida right near the Orlando airport. Right, because he thinks that's all. He thinks it's one of the global megaplex, metroplexes that's being built around hub airports, with certain things, and they're trying to build a next generation, 5G everywhere, training centers, healthcare. He's got University of Florida down there, basically riding the wealthy baby boomer, kind of next gen community health, full life kind of thing. But you can imagine a place like that. My goodness, that you could, the relationship of transportation of stuff and support and care and all kinds of things around the healthcare issue and being healthy issue is just massive and growing. Anyway, so Andrew asks, let's see, we've got about 6 minutes, a little less. Andrew asks, how far are state and local laws from being created? I think, could I ask a broader question, Andrew, related kind of, where are the places where you're seeing innovation and where you're seeing blockers in terms of laws and so forth, as you look forward? Obviously, you said Arizona, is big proponent, and I don't know if Arizona State University is involved in that. Mike Crow over there is just an amazing leader, but where are you seeing kind of bright spots and dark spots?
I don't know that we see dark spots, and I'm not, that's not marketing speak. There's sort of a couple of factors here, right? Number one is there's some very large players, larger than us, right? Namely the traditional car companies, who also, frankly, would like a standard uniform set of rules around how this stuff should work, right? Nobody really wants a patchwork of state laws, particularly if you're building passenger vehicles that might travel between 10 states in a month or whatever, right? You can't have a different set of rules in one state and another. So everyone would like the federal government to sort of preempt the states and come up with a standard legislation, and I think that will eventually happen, right? As all things, it probably will take longer than we would like.
Not with the Supreme Court. That's another whole conversation.
That's another conversation. But so that's a big part of it, right? Is the federal legislation, I think, will eventually sort of adhere to some standard, and then the states will eventually just sort of adhere to that federally mandated component. In the meantime, I think states have started to see just how valuable it is to have companies like Nuro and this technology brought to their state. So maybe 4 or 5 years ago, there was perhaps California, maybe Arizona, and 1 or 2 others. Today, I don't have the exact number, but I think it's something on the order of 20 to 30 states have already passed AV legislation to allow some form of AV operation, right? So there are tests in Florida today. There's tests here in Washington, D.C., where I am, tests in California, Nevada, Arizona, Texas, and many, many more. And so I don't think there's a whole lot that's going to actually slow things down very much from a regulatory or sort of federal or state level at all.
Fascinating. Yeah, I mean, it's I imagine we'll actually see competition among the states, right? To be, to want to land you. One last question here that we'll take before I have a final question I want to ask you about. What do you think about drone delivery? I mean, I guess one way to consider is you are drone delivery. You just happen to go on the ground. But I mean, you know what I mean?
We're drones on the road. Yeah, I guess.
Should I think of? I know, my buddies who work with the Pentagon and stuff. They think of the battle space, right, under the sea, on the surface, low, just under the surface, on the surface, just above the surface. I mean, they have it. It's like like an Italian pastry, right? I mean, it's like layer cake. How do you guys think about it?
Look, I think drone delivery will be a thing, right? I think it's just it will be a subset of the universe that on-road delivery can handle. So if you think about groceries, I think it's pretty unlikely that you're going to see $100, $200 baskets worth of groceries delivered in a meaningful way with like a swarm of drones going around the city, just sort of dropping the stuff off, both because the payloads are very significant. The drones themselves are typically quite loud. There's certain parts of the country where I think people would use them as skeet shotter for, whatever, right? It's not the easiest technology to bring to bear in some respects. The place where I think it has real value maybe is in sort of more rural communities where the distance as the crow flies is significantly better than the distance on the road. And in that environment, maybe packages and things like that have a real fit for drones. And so if you look at where drones have commercialized so far, I think the biggest and most significant area I've seen is actually in the medical space, where they've been doing vaccine deliveries and things of that nature. Not so much in the United States, frankly, in other countries, but that feels like a really logical sort of place for it, right? Fast, high value, low weight, low payload deliveries that are critical in nature. That makes sense. But I think if you think of your pizza, you probably don't want that thing flying through the air, getting cooled. your burritos, your groceries, even arguably some of your packages you probably don't want being airlifted at thousands of feet in the air.
Absolutely. Well, Cosimo, on the image of flying pizza, we will call a halt because I know we're coming at the end. Boy, I could just go for hours. It's so fascinating. Thank you for making the time. Congratulations on the fantastic work that you're doing, the unbelievable partnerships and so forth. I hope we can continue the conversation because, as I say, I think this is a fundamental thing that business people need to understand, no matter what business you're in. And then personally, it's going to get very interesting as well, I think, from a bunch of different dimensions. So thanks so much for the work you do. Great to catch up with you, and so happy that things are going well.
Likewise. Thank you, John.
It's a pleasure. So in terms of, if you want to know about this topic or more on it, we have additional materials and such. We do this under a Creative Commons license, so feel free to use it, and because we believe in the sharing of great ideas, like the TED Talks do, and just do the normal thing about referring where you get it from, and feel free to use it in any manner that you feel will be beneficial. Thanks again, Cosimo. Thanks to the audience. Hope to see you all again next month when we'll have another speaker.
Thank you, everyone.